Welcome back. Welcome to the final plenary session of the conference. This session focuses on an extremely exciting and timely topic, technology and public law. We're very honored to have invited three distinguished scholars to speak to us. They are Professor Christopher Yoo from University of Pennsylvania, Professor Yeung from University of Birmingham, Professor Frank Pasquale from University of Maryland. Let's welcome them. May we first invite Professor Yoo to speak to us on the general topic of public law and technology. Professor Yoo, please.
Well, let me add my thanks to Cora for organizing all her work and all of the people at Hong Kong University for putting on what has been a wonderful conference, and to thank all of you for sticking into the bitter end. Always fearful at the last event whether there will be people here, and I'm gratified to see so many. Just so you know, my task is to provide a more general overview of the topics and of technology and public law. Necessarily, it will be somewhat breezy and somewhat superficial because obviously almost every topic I could bring up would merit a talk in and of itself, but I'm happy to try to do what I can to introduce the basic topic. And more importantly, it's a combination of ideas to which I'm very personally committed. We are actually at Penn developing an entire curriculum where a number of our JD students are getting masters in engineering to train a new type of legal professional, on the belief that the idea where we can simply be baffled by the technical concepts and be afraid of them are over. And unfortunately, there are many ways to make decisions about policy. Ignorance is probably not the best one, and the hope is to give people access to the intuitions and the ideas underlying basic technical concepts and to make them work for law and policy. So there has been, I should say, a very obvious transformation taking place, probably exemplified by our newfound dependence on our smartphones. We forget that it was only a little over a decade ago in 2007 that the smartphone came into existence, where Apple transformed what had been a sleepy category under the leadership of BlackBerry and Palm into a multi-trillion-dollar endeavor that's created a great deal of value. What has been flying under the radar a bit has been not just its impact on the commercial world and the way private individuals use the technology. I think all of us who travel now have access to much better information on the fly than we ever had and can navigate in ways that were unimaginable even a decade ago. But what's striking to me is there are many transformations happening. Some of them are more obvious than others, such as about the ones listed at the bottom, privacy, free speech, questions about globalism and the increasing mobility of data. I actually want to focus on three discrete topics. The first is how technology has changed the way citizens interact with the public law process. The second, the change exemplified by the advent of e-government and what that means for citizens. And second is to really talk about the change in institutional settings and really the reconceiving of the notion of the state in the reallocation of certain functions to increasingly private actors. And then lastly, even not just at the institutions, but the processes all these institutions use to foreshadow the topics being covered by both my co-panelists. I'll spend some time talking about artificial intelligence and predictive analytics and how that's transforming the law and how public law and how it's being implemented. But also by way of introduction, I'm really quite struck by the dramatic change in the tone of the discourse just in the last 2 years. From about the mid-90s until 2016 or so, technology law and the impact of technology was celebrated. We almost couldn't say enough good things about it. It was perceived to be the future, and all of the benefits that were accruing to us were thought to be an unmitigated good. About 2 years ago, there was a marked turn in the discourse where we became much more critical and much more nervous or fearful about the impact of technology on the public life. And I guess maybe this is an Asian thing in me, not to fly too high, not to fly too low. My natural instinct is to try to find a middle ground. That was probably, the benefits of technology were probably overhyped in the 90s, that we were probably blind to some of the concerns. But at this point, we have a fairly alarmist tone where people are saying that technology is a source of great concern. And I think that that's well taken and appropriate, but at the same time, I don't want to lose sight of the wonderful benefits that some of the technology has given to us and gives us real insight into all innovations. They're always two-edged swords. Everything that has benefits can be abused. And that, in fact, our goal is to actually create frameworks to understanding both sides and to create trade-offs for striking balances somewhere in between that benefit all the values that we hold dear. So starting first about e-government and increased citizen participation, I think all of us as legal researchers are well aware of the tremendous access to information that is now available online that is really unprecedented. Not just to researchers, but to citizens. You can now gain access to legal source materials, but the submissions of other people, all the interim documents, it's simply dazzling. And the ability for common citizens and researchers alike to gain access to that has been nothing short of spectacular. And in fact, what we see is e-government as being a tremendously positive force for internet adoption and for broadening out the benefits to all citizens around the world. It's not just information, though. It has become increasingly easy to gain access to government services. It no longer requires leaving your office during a workday and standing in line, often multiple lines, taking up a great deal of your time to do something as routine as, for those of us who travel, applying for a re-entry permit would used to take a day. All this has been greatly facilitated. But to more serious things, welfare benefits, different healthcare benefits, all different kinds of government services are increasingly accessible online and in a much more easy way that we ever dreamed. And then most importantly to me is there is an opportunity under technology for citizens to take an increasingly participatory role. Really going to the idea of Hirschman and the whole notion of exit and voice, voice is now more possible than it ever has been, both in government processes, but also in these private, quasi-governmental processes. There's huge opportunities for involvement and participation. And I think that that's really a wonderful, wonderful benefit that we fail to appreciate when we step back and remember what things were like 10 or 20 years ago. When that sort of ability to participate in processes was not really feasible. So what's interesting to me is everything such as the advent of technology is always a two-edged sword. I'm always struck whenever you deal with things in digital formats, they become quite rigid. And I'm always reminded of Max Weber's warning about bureaucratization. It allows organizations to process enormous amounts of information, but it does so by creating what he called the iron cage. It becomes increasingly irrational because small deviations cause you to be stalled and prevented from participating. But the other thing that we have to remember is all systems can be gamed. And that's not to say that the systems are bad, it's just an inherent nature of anything beneficial. Just to give you a very easy example, an unprecedented thing happened in the United States in the most recent proceeding on network neutrality. 22 million, just shy of 22 million people filed comments and actively participated in regulatory processes, which is something to be celebrated. What's quite interesting is there's actually been some interesting analyses of these different problems. First, as a first order, 60% of those comments were in favor of network neutrality and opposed the repeal of the rules. But it was a roughly, it's not a completely one-sided. 60-40 is a fairly interesting balance, and it's not a plebiscite, of course. Good administrative processes have to proceed on good reasoning. What's fascinating, though, is people have done analysis of the number of emails that were fake, and that, in fact, there are fake domains, entire domains of emails that don't belong to anyone. And in analysis, sometimes some cuts of removing duplicates or removing fake email addresses lead to 60-40 support the other way, or in some cases 70-30 or even 86-14 when you eliminate duplicate addresses. And so one of the interesting questions is, what do we make of all this? Approximately 10% of these submissions came from outside the United States, the largest number of which came from Russia. And it's an interesting sort of questions in participatory democracy, something that's actually very good for a lot of government processes, obviously can be abused. And all things we'll discover can be gamed, and we'll talk about some other examples before. In short, when technologists use the word dual use, all technologies are dual use. They can be used for beneficial purposes. They can also be used for adverse purposes. And that is an irreducible fact, and that's something that I think we need to embrace and understand and design to try to make it possible. We need to be sophisticated about doing it, but the other thing that I would say consistently, one of the threads I will leave you with, is that this is inherently an exercise in the second best. Pointing out that there are flaws in the participation doesn't end the analysis. We have to ask ourselves, but what would the world look like without that participation? That world is far from ideal as well, and what we really need to do is to think about this, avoid the nirvana fallacy that what is the opposite of bad must be good, and to start to think about the trade-offs in ways that are very, very important, and that actually, in my opinion, come out most clearly in terms of AI. Institutional structure has been really completely changed in many ways by the advent of technology. What you see is a gradual downplaying of importance of traditional UN-based international organizations and often domestic regulatory organizations in favor of private entities. The literature on stock exchanges is probably the best developed, where they analyze how much of securities regulation has migrated from governments to stock exchanges, which are nominally private institutions. In the technology space, the power is actually wielded a great deal by what we call standard-setting organizations. These are the ones that set things for cell phones, for Wi-Fi, for the USB port, for programming languages, for many, many different aspects that we think of are all set by what are now private organizations. We normally think of very few of them. There are actually more than 200 of them. And one good example is the nature of Wi-Fi versus Bluetooth, which was two standards set up by different people, and they vied for supremacy. Now, what's quite interesting is after a standard has been settled on, it has an inevitable quality where it looks like they are going to be dominant. If you go back in time, people predicted generally that Bluetooth would be the dominant technology and Wi-Fi would be a small niche product. And what we saw, instead of mandated government processes that dictated what option of one or the other, what we saw was standards competition where people chose to adopt whichever one they wanted or thought was better. And that, in fact, what we see the exact opposite of what people expected occurred is Wi-Fi emerged as the dominant technology. This is a very different mode of operation, and it yields us many, many different advantages. It shifts away from centralized governmental processes and gets away from the inevitable circularity that Charles Lindblom identified, that in fact the incumbents with revenue streams tend to dominate formal legal processes simply because they have the resources to be able to do that. Second, it really opens up a possibility of Tibu-style voting with your feet, giving a whole new emphasis to Hirschman's idea of exit and making that quite real. Right now, the vast majority of standards are never adopted. There's hundreds of them that lay idle. Simply put, you put them out and you put them up the flagpole and you see what people choose. And that's actually been a very powerful way to create a much more flexible innovation system. It creates more breathing room for experimentation because you don't need to go to regulatory processes. You can actually innovate and do different ways to get your standard out in front of people and let them choose. And there is a different element of public participation. Standard-setting organizations often create explicit categories of participation for user groups and other categories of participants who are often not included in formal processes. There are disadvantages. Allowing standards competition is messy. It takes time. It can be costly. It actually is missing every decision-making structure has potential biases. All of these standard-setting organizations have voting mechanisms that actually have outcome impacts. And then lastly, you're missing public processes have the virtue of creating rights, participatory rights, appeal rights, different forms of obligations that are not uniformly present in all standard-setting organizations. And so you end up having an interesting choice dynamic, which leads us to actually think about how we can design these organizations better to make them more responsive to the kinds of values that we lose by changing over to private organizations. So that's about how people are participating differently and how institutions are changing. What's much more interesting to me, and it's not an accident that my co-panelists will be spending most of the time talking about it, is how those institutions actually are changing the way they operate. And in general, the dominant theme that's coming out now is the use of predictive analytics. They're using this in criminal law for parole decisions, for sentencing decisions. They're using it for child and family services investigations. They're using it to allocate an enormous number of investigatory resources in all public institutions. And in fact, there is a war going on in AI between two very different approaches, and I could say a war, but largely the first of these two is winning. There's one that's really championed, and there's a wonderful fight between Peter Norvig of Google and Noam Chomsky of MIT. Noam Chomsky believes that AI should mimic human thought, and that we should try to see how we cognitively think of problems and design software to mimic those decisions. The other school really is just about statistical probabilities. They actually don't want to know why, they just want to know the likelihood based on past information that a particular event is going to happen. And the traditional thing you do is you divide your data in half, you train your AI on half the data, and then you use the other half to validate it, and once you've validated it, you have some confidence that you have some idea of how successful it is at approximating results. So to give you a very, very simple example, imagine you're looking for the frequency you have three letters, C, I, and E. And you want to know what is the likelihood, what are the possibilities of the next letter? Well, we have rules. One is I before E except after C. This breaks the actual rules. And so we'd have to have a sophisticated, to do a Chomsky-style analysis to understanding of the exact contours of the exceptions when they apply and the like. The other approach simply statistically looks at every possible word in whatever language you're focusing on and assigns probabilities based on the likelihood of what the next letter is going to be. Understanding things like Q and Z are relatively unlikely, and I put up 4 examples here of letters that do follow C, I, and E, and you actually can make a prediction about what is coming next. Can you ask why is it an N or why is it a T? No. It's simply a statistical probability. There is no actual rationale about why it is what it is. And this is but in a very, very simplistic sort of way, and obviously predictive analytics have become much more sophisticated, a very, very simple boil down of how this works. So this has different advantages and disadvantages. Actually, AI of this nature is very good at finding patterns that no one found before. We actually have very good query tools for data, but it's hard to let data talk to you. The question I always wanted to know is, what question am I not asking that I should be asking? What is the pattern in this data that is new that I have not identified? AI can actually do that on predictive analytics just by running large numbers. It can be better than the alternatives in the sense that we are actually looking at people, they've done studies about how experts make decisions versus how predictive analytics do. The predictive analytics tend to do better. And there's also a reality of what we call human-computer interaction. We used to think there's a limit to the amount of computing power we could use as humans because it would be dictated by how many keystrokes and how much time you could spend facing a keyboard. Now, predictive analytics are doing much, much more, allowing us to use that power much greater. So the easy example I give my students is, think about the things we used to have to do in the car. We used to have to turn the headlights on. When we wanted intermittent windshield wipers, we'd have to turn them on and off. We'd have to lock the doors. All of those functions are now automated for us. And now we no longer have to deal with those. And in fact, we can now focus on other things. Predictive analytics is doing something very, very similar. The problems with it is, based on the training, you can only find patterns that actually exist in the data. So if you go outside your data into situations that you've never seen before, you'll actually get mistakes. This is why the programs are so unpredictable, or so bad at predicting the weather. Second, if there's biases inherent in the data, the AI will simply replicate them. And by definition, it won't find anything you haven't coded for in the data as well. It cannot provide reasons why, which in law and burden shifting and all the different things we do is very traditional. And that, in fact, what we're discovering is there are AI people, including people at my university, who are able to code in and correct for example, racial bias. But there is an inevitable problem with that, which is if you deviate from the AI recommended solution, you will be trading off between efficiency and whatever other value you're attempting to promote. And so if you're trying to use predictive analytics, for example, to save children's lives by investigating the cases that have historically been the most problematic, you can correct for them, but you should expect a worse performance than you would see if you'd actually stuck straight to the data. And this is, among AI scholars, is an irreducible problem. It isn't to say that we shouldn't make those concessions at some time, but we need to do them with both eyes open. To give you a couple of what I think of as creepy examples about AI, Facebook created a negotiating bot, an AI-driven negotiating bot. It did two things that certainly freaked out their designers, and they soon shut it off. First, it invented its own language. Now, before we get too upset, it was just abbreviations and things that we all do. We use buzzwords and initials. It was actually much more sophisticated about it, but it got to the point where the humans couldn't understand it. The second thing it did was it lied. Now, we know anytime you're in a negotiation for prices, you actually have, if you're measuring the outcome, you will sometimes say, oh, I'm not going to pay a penny more than $100, when we all know that, in fact, you do, and we'll find out later that you do pay more. When we say it lies, it's to make it sound very dramatic, but in fact, what we see is it learned that by actually representing your true valuation, you don't actually end up with the best result, which is something all of us know intuitively. The other thing that was very interesting was Microsoft created a social network AI-driven chatbot that very, very quickly became a cesspool of hate. And what's quite interesting is the chatbot was designed to find the threads that its speakers found the most interesting and then reinforce them and replicate them. What Microsoft didn't count on is trolls. People who figured out that, in fact, that is how the chatbot was working and started feeding it disinformation that was not actually held, of opinions that were not held by anybody. And as a good AI system, it began to replicate them, and pretty soon it became a very, very unfortunate situation where they began to shut it down. This is one classic blind spot that technologists have. Technologists are very idealistic. They tend not to prepare for hostile environments and people who are intentionally trying to screw up the beautiful results they're trying to accomplish. And so this is another dimension of this which I think is generally understudied and underappreciated. So in conclusion, I do want to say that, in fact, there are a lot, we shouldn't lose in the criticisms of all of the technology now that there are tremendous benefits that anyone who looks back even 10 years will recall. But the fact is that we can find problems doesn't mean that there's something inherently evil about it. All tools we have can be abused. And that requires us to be reflective, to design processes that are robust against the ones we can identify. But most importantly to me, we shouldn't hold things up against a perfection standard. And what I see in, for example, autonomous vehicles, people will say, oh, someone was injured, therefore the AI is faulty, or someone was killed. The interesting question to me is, okay, as opposed to what? We all know that driver error is one of the huge problems, one of the leading cause of car accidents, and that we're not actually comparing with the ideal situation where no one has accidents. We're comparing it to a real-world situation without AI where we have lots of accidents. And we're going to have enormous incommensurability problems. The kinds of accidents that AI is likely to get into will be different, and they may well be more harmful. And so we're going to have to not just compare equivalent situations, but look at different orders of accidents, whether the AI is trying to make parole decisions or whatever it's attempting to do. And we're going to have to unravel all of this. But the key here is to really think about these in the kinds of ways that we're used to thinking about as a trade-off. But as trade-offs, to really not idealize the intervention to say, oh, here's a problem, law can fix this. But to understand the intervention itself will be less than perfect, and the status quo will be less than perfect. So as we think about this, we actually have to develop a more sophisticated way of thinking about the trade-offs. And then lastly, we always have to remember there will always be trolls. And that we have to think about hostile environments and really think about how we're going to design this. We see this in tort. Sometimes we call them intervening actors and absolve people from liability. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we say that's foreseeable. There's an easy remedial measure that someone should take, and that has to be anticipated and designed in. This is the stuff of law, and this is what I found I'm actually on a number of National Science Foundation grants with engineers, and I think that when I talk about them about concepts like this, and they actually really appreciate it because it gives them concrete design criteria and ways they can trade off how they can think about what a properly designed product looks like. And in fact, well, it creates a very vibrant discourse between technology and law, which I think is just the beginning of what I hope will be a promising new era. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Yoo. We'd now like to invite Professor Pasquale to speak to us on legal automation, rule by law, and the rule of law. And I did note that there's a "the" before rule of law, the rule of law. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cora, and thank you to Professor Chen, to HKU, to ICON for having me here. It's a great honor to get a chance to try to bridge the public law, private law divide a bit in some of these areas. And I also wanted to note before going further that on Twitter, I'm at Frank Pasquale, and I've got a pinned tweet where I have tried to document many of the sources that I'll be using today in case, because I will apologize in advance for two things. I'll go through these slides relatively quickly, and I'm sorry for the horrific robot clip art, but any presentation on AI is not complete without it. Now, with respect to, in a nutshell, my argument today, my argument is that both legal automation and the rule by law, are on the rise, and that there are elective affinities between these concepts. My idea is that each of them are being justified by emergency, urgency, and an ideology of the superior knowledge of elites over other players within the legal system. And they are a bridge between arbitrariness and full rule of law. I think, though, that these affinities disclose potential partnerships among public and private law scholars, and I will get into some of these potential partnerships towards the end of the talk today. Just to make this really concrete, I want us to think in terms of what we would use algorithms and data for. In the magazine Defense One, there was a story about IBM saying that its software has the answer for, say, countries that get a huge number of people at their borders. They need to decide, are they refugee or terrorist? Well, guess what? IBM has black box software that's going to classify them. Okay? And also with respect to the development of a virtual border fence in the United States, there's been some thought that Palmer Luckey of Oculus would help develop a new company called Andalier that would essentially very quickly determine, say, who should be and who should not be at certain points along the border. What I want to ask about with respect to these types of developments is, should these types of data and algorithms used in these scenarios be used as evidence? Should they ever be used to make a certain determination? And I'm going to come back to those questions after going through some elements of the rule of law and rule by law and some more concrete examples. Now, in terms of conceptions of the rule of law, we have conceptions of the rule of law, and I'm drawing here from Richard Fallon's article, The Rule of Law as Concept in Constitutional Discourse. There are a couple historist or formalist conceptions that we're all familiar with, right, and that come out of very august works within jurisprudence. But what I want to focus on today is the third conception, one of legal process. And this is developed in Hart and Sachs's work, and I'm particularly interested in legal process, the third dimension of legal process, a reasoned elaboration of the connection between recognized pre-existing sources of legal authority and the determination of rights and responsibilities in particular cases. Now, to the extent that, say, the algorithm deciding whether someone is a refugee or a potential terrorist is black boxed, to the extent that data or algorithms are not available, we can see an immediate challenge to this third aspect of legal process, right? That's an immediate sort of problem there. And one of the questions that we have to ask about, I believe, is to what extent do we want to defend that aspect of legal process? I'll also connect that, by the way, to Christopher's point just in the presentation before on explainable versus non-explainable AI. And I would say that, I fall very much on the explainable camp, what Christopher associated with Noam Chomsky. But very recently, the computer scientist Judea Pearl made a very bracing argument about the fundamental importance of explainability in machine learning to its status as science. And I greatly recommend his book, The Book of Why, on that topic. Now, in terms of legal process, we have to acknowledge that legal process is expensive, right? It is costly in economic terms to provide independent decision makers, to listen to both sides. I could go through the whole litany that Judge Henry Friendly gives in his article, Some Kind of Hearing, from the 1970s. Right? This is difficult. And in the whole jurisprudence of due process, we get a lot of concerns about this cost. Of course, it's also costly in terms of power. As we saw from Professor Kim-Blaine Chappelle's wonderful presentation yesterday, it is very costly for an authoritarian or autocratic regime to maintain an independent judiciary because people within that judiciary may disagree, right? It would be much easier to simply program people or computers to do what the people in command want. And that is one of Gregoire Chamayou's fundamental arguments against drone warfare in his book, Drone Theory, that type of programming is quite troubling. Now, thinking about rule by law, that's a fallback often, right? Rule by law, countries might say, or jurisdictions might say, we may not have full rule of law, but we have rule by law. Similarly, we might say, hey, we don't give you a full hearing in front of a person, but you got the phone tree, right? Or you got to go in front of the computer and plead your case to the computer. And I think that these less costly aspects of the rule of law may be simulated or even preserved in some of these scenarios, right? And those may be in terms of legal norms being laid out in advance or prescriptions existing prior to their application. But the full legal process conception of rule of law is not available in rule by law. I think that's something fundamental in the work that, say, is, there's so much work done by scholars at this conference, I think particularly of the introduction by Ginsburg and Mustafa to their book, Rule by Law. Now, themes in legal automation are that computational classification or dispute settlement is faster, fitter, cheaper, more productive than having persons involved. But there are problems that remain that include systematic errors and biases. I'm going to go into a few of those in the next few slides. One of the most important areas here is benefit determinations. And my colleague Danielle Citron, in her work, Technological Due Process, was a real pioneer here in terms of her excavation of the problems with the Colorado benefits management system. More recently, Virginia Eubanks, someone who's done fantastic work on looking on the ground application of automation in benefits determinations, has found many troubling examples of people being denied benefits just via a computer program. We've also seen examples in the Australian context with the Centrelink robo-debt scandal. And in that situation, there was an effort by the government justified by austerity measures, or perhaps supposedly justified by austerity measures, to try to recoup overpayments from benefits claimants. But as Scarlett Wilcox showed in her excellent presentation on robo-debt here at this conference, there were great problems with this system, not least of which it was extrapolating income from, say, a given week or month to a yearly income figure for claimants in scenarios where it was well known by all that they're in precarious situations and their income will go up and down over the year, right? And this is a situation where I believe that many of these systems are being used almost as a distancing measure, right? And my colleague Mark Graber has discussed in some work about the judiciary as sort of political cover for what might be wanted by politicians but couldn't be achieved, say, directly. And I think this is a very difficult issue in terms of computers being used for the same purposes, right, as this sort of cover, this objective cover for something that ultimately should not be sort of done by the state and is a distancing effect by the state, right? I think also, if we think about predictive policing, this is an area where there are other problems with respect to legal automation that I think are really worth considering and reflecting on in depth. One of the elements here is you can have, as Andrew Guthrie Ferguson has shown in his book, The Rise of Big Data Policing, you can have an effort by authorities to decide where to allocate policing resources. How do they decide? All too often, the way that they decide is they look at past data as to where crimes have been committed. As we all know, it is not as if in the past policing resources were equally distributed in a perfectly just and rational way across the entire society in a way that would satisfy, say, statisticians or others to determine exactly where crimes were being committed. Instead, they were often concentrated in a racist way. And I've got a map of my hometown of Baltimore, in terms of showing its history of redlining. Same types of problems showed up with respect to allocation of police resources. Then what happens is that when that past data gets fed into the current supposedly neutral and algorithmic system, it ends up essentially laundering the past bias into a supposedly objective assessment of where crime is bad, and ends up sending more and more police to that area, where of course they're going to find more crime, because if you put more police in an area, you're going to find more crime. It's just a matter of how densely you look over a certain place. And so this is really a problem, and it's also covered by Kathy O'Neill in her wonderful book, Weapons of Math Destruction, where she talks in great detail about the self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of many of these algorithmic systems and the way in which they can reinforce disadvantage. We also have to be really worried about where data is coming from. This is from a study by Wu and Yeung on automated inference of criminality using face images. And this study has been widely panned and criticized in the machine learning community, because essentially what it did is it took a group of about 1,000 faces of criminals and 1,000 faces of non-criminals, tried to sort of mathematically average the types of faces among the criminals and the non-criminals. And then the top row of 4 faces on the left is sort of the more likely to be criminal faces, the bottom row is the less likely to be criminal faces, right? I mean, this goes all the way back to Lombroso and phrenology. It's just very deeply troubling. But what's astonishing is that in their work, after they were criticized, they did not back down. They said that this type of algorithmic assessment of likelihood to commit crime is deeply objective because the computer is not racist, right? But they're not looking at, or the computer doesn't have any biases or any other sort of problems that might afflict, say, human police officers. But of course, certain data is being fed in, and we don't really know enough about that data. We certainly, and I don't think we really want people judged in this way, even if we did have, say, a magically representative source of data on criminals and non-criminals. That's why Citron and I, in our 2014 work, The Scored Society, offered many warnings about data and algorithms. We stated that automated systems are claimed to rate all individuals in the same way, but because human beings program these predictive algorithms, we have to be suspicious of that claim, because all the biases that could exist among humans could be transported into algorithmic systems. We also believe that they mine data sets that contain inaccurate and biased information provided by people, right? And this is such a problem because, in the United States, we have this problem of big data blacklisting, as Margaret Hu has described it. We have no-fly lists, no work lists, no voting lists. The no-work list, sort of set up via E-Verify, has notices of non-confirmation of citizenship status or work eligibility status that often are only sent to an employer that checks, and are not even sent to the person who has been determined by a database mismatch to be ineligible, right? And this is a deep problem. It really provides inadequate notice and opportunity for redress. What I think is particularly intellectually daring about Margaret Hu's work, though, is that she goes beyond remedies of procedural due process to argue that there should be a substantive due process right against some applications of these big data systems, that they are as offensive to ideas of human liberty and dignity as other governmental restrictions found violative of substantive due process. And I think that in some situations when, for example, you have repeated error rates in the 20, 30, 40%, impossibility of really getting quick redress, disadvantaged populations, we really have to think seriously about that level of critique. Also at this conference, there were wonderful presentations on social credit scoring, really insightful work looking at on-the-ground application of efforts in China to provide a trustworthiness score for all citizens. These graphics are from the Wall Street Journal. And I just want us to think, in line with critiques of scoring, artificial intelligence, big data analytics, because I think these are all related concepts about certain aspects of what's going on here with respect to the social credit scoring. You might notice that one of the elements that comes into social input is filial piety, okay? To the extent to which people go and visit their parents and support them. Now, one thing I wondered when I saw that is I thought back to a presentation I gave for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the United States on their hospital ranking system and the way in which they used advanced algorithms to decide, say, rankings and ratings of healthcare entities in accountable care organizations. And as I was thinking back to that, one of the things that they think is absolutely essential to rankings and ratings is something called risk adjustment. So if you're a hospital that gets a large number of very sick, very poor people, what risk adjustment does is it takes that into account and says, you had a harder job than the hospital that has lots of healthy, young, wealthier people, okay? And I thought to myself, I wonder if social credit scoring will ever have risk adjustment. So for the filial piety score, if you have difficult parents, you get more points for spending, say, an hour with them. But if you have less difficult parents, maybe you have to spend 2 or 3 hours, right? And I know it seems like kind of a frivolous sort of idea here, but I think what's important about it is that as we see this credit scoring, we have works like Sally Ann Gilmary's The Tyranny of Quantification, on the seductions of quantification, Jerry Muller on the tyranny of metrics. All of this literature needs to enter into any social credit scoring system. I'll also note on a humorous aspect here that it's been reported that in the social credit scoring context, banks have sometimes been sending discrediting bad information about their best customers. Now, why would you do that? Well, heck, if that's in the system and there's no way to appeal, and right now often there is no way to appeal, then all your competitors will look at your best customer and they'll say, oh, wow, what an awful person, can't loan to them. Then you are left making the loans to your best customer, right? So the system fails even on its own terms to the extent it doesn't have basic elements of, say, a right to correction or other rights of inspection and disputation that Clement Chen here and others have talked about. Now, fortunately, there is pressure for accountability in these algorithmic determinations. You look at activists like the group Data for Black Lives, who have pushed very hard against data-driven systems that have a disparate impact on minority groups. Also, there are academics within the computer science community. So I co-edited this volume called Transparent Data Mining for Big and Small Data, where we convened a group of social scientists, lawyers, computer scientists, in order to try to figure out, are there technical solutions? I'll also say that I've had the immense privilege of traveling to workshops at Academia Sinica and National Taiwan University in Taipei, where they've brought together some great experts on computer science, social science, and law to think deeply about what algorithmic accountability looks like in these contexts. I'll also note that we can sometimes think of firms themselves as being autocracies, okay? So sometimes there are ways in which for a firm like Google is just so powerful over, say, how you're represented on the web. And how do we sort of deal with that? How do we deal with what is essentially rule by law by corporate chieftains when they're determining whether to, say, take down copyrighted material or leave up or take down material that you find discrediting, et cetera? In Europe, something like the right to be forgotten guarantees citizens there the ability to, say, have some control over the representation of results attached to a name search query. Not all results related to them, but only results attached to a name search query based on them. I think that's a very important element of getting beyond, say, rule by law by these firms. I'd also note that Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, is excellent in terms of its ability to both shame and convene resistance to representations of minority groups that are discrediting on Google. And finally, very recently, among labor at Google sort of had an uprising and said, we don't want to work on, say, a worldwide global drone facial recognition assassination system, right? And this is something that also right now Microsoft employees are doing with respect to the companies contracting for ICE, given some of the really horrifying impacts of ICE enforcement in the United States very recently. I would note that, there are examples, and again to draw on work that I was exposed to by Professor Elaine Chappelle, there are examples of professions pushing for essentially better governance of firms, even if they are autocratic or are under tight control. And I think that in general, I hope for efforts like the Tech Workers Alliance and better labor law to allow those who work at large technology firms to themselves help the firm police or act conscientiously when they are contracting with government in many of these contexts. So my parting thoughts will be a return to the original example I gave of IBM's effort to develop a scoring system that would tell or advise officials as to whether individuals are potential refugee, or are refugees or terrorists or both. And I think that the problem here is that essentially this type of software, given all of the problems that we have already detailed, should first of all only be used as an adjunct to human decision-making. It should not replace human decision-making. Secondly, any human making these decisions should be trained about all of the aspects of algorithmic bias and problems of data that I just discussed. We have groups like the Council on Big Data Ethics in Society. We've put forward a publication called 10 Simple Rules for Responsible Big Data Research. There's lots of other material out there. I have a spreadsheet of 170 data ethics and computer science courses that I share with lots of anyone who wants it. I think this is deeply important, that we have this ability to maintain human connection and a human review of these judgments, and to have people trained in it. And that's where I have an article in the MIT Technology Review on the problems of, say, even predictive sentencing models or other forms of predictive models. So with that, I greatly thank you. There's my contact information. The book is both out in Mandarin and English, and I'd love to have it published in other languages. And so I really appreciate your attention. So thank you. Reed.
Thank you very much, Professor Pasquale. Now may we invite Professor Yeung to speak to us on big data-driven government towards a new public analytics in public administration. Professor Yeung, thank you.
This is my clicker. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for hanging out to the bitter end at this conference. I am humbled and privileged to be here at this wonderful celebration for Hong Kong University, and I'm extremely grateful to my hosts for giving me the opportunity to be here today. It's particularly special for me because I was here in Hong Kong about 40 years ago. That was the last time I was here in Hong Kong. My filial piety hasn't been very good, I'm afraid. So it's a pleasure to be back here, and in many ways, 40 years ago is a kind of significant point of departure, because it was the point at which, if I can get these slides to come down, we started to see the emergence of a phenomenon in public administration known as the new public management, which I'm sure the administrative lawyers amongst you will be familiar with. And today I'm going to talk about what I will suggest is becoming the successor to the new public management, which I refer to as the new public analytics. And we've already heard quite a lot about that in Frank's talk. And so to give you some examples, which we've already seen, which Frank has talked about, to illustrate what I mean by the new public analytics. So we see in the USA, for example, the no-fly list, which means that if your name is on that list, you can't get on board an aeroplane, is partly administered by an algorithmic decision-making system that utilizes machine learning. And as Frank has already mentioned, various police authorities in the US utilize predictive policing, which again uses machine learning to predict the location of anticipated crime hotspots, and increasingly to identify high-risk individuals who may be at risk of being involved in some future crime event. We also see similarities in these kinds of applications in the UK. So, for example, the HMRC, the Revenue Authority, uses an AI system to optimise call centre outcomes when they come in, when individuals call for advice, and the British Highways Authority uses a smart motorway system to obtain feedback on road conditions from embedded sensors in the infrastructure in order to anticipate and manage traffic flow. So these are just some examples of the new public analytics. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the core logic of what I refer to as the new public analytics, and I'm going to do this by comparing and contrasting it with its predecessor, the new public management. And then I'm going to consider two trends in public administration that came about following the end of new public management, which is estimated to be around about 2005. And they are, firstly, the rise of risk as an organising principle in public sector management, especially in the UK. And secondly, the digitisation of government, or e-government, within part of the modernisation of government agenda. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit about a pilot study that I did with some colleagues last year to try and identify the extent to which new public analytics has been taken up in British public administration. And finally, to ask, what are the implications of this turn to the new public analytics for public lawyers? What are the challenges that we face as public lawyers in responding to the rise of new public analytics before concluding? So here it is in a nutshell. The take-home version is this, that we are witnessing the rise of what I call the new public analytics, or NPA, a public sector reform movement in governmental decision-making and public administration across a number of industrialised countries, including in the UK and the US, but not limited to those countries, across a number of policy domains. And I'm going to suggest that the new public analytics can be characterised as the ideological and conceptual successor to the new public management, which emerged in the early 80s or late 1970s, which ended in around about the mid-2000s, early 2000s. I'm going to suggest that although British implementation of the new public analytics is considerably behind the vision of an agile, data-driven government to which it aspires, nevertheless, I expect that the new public analytics will progress and mature and become more embedded in public sector administration as the years pass, and it will eventually become the dominant paradigm in public service delivery in coming years. And I'm going to suggest that this turn to NPA generates profound and important challenges for public law, and that we as public lawyers must radically adapt our thinking, vocabulary and frame of reference in order to grapple with these challenges if we are to champion the foundational principles of public law and give them meaningful expression within a hyper-networked, data-driven age. So that's it in a nutshell. Let me unpack the argument by starting with, what do I mean by the new public analytics? So I refer to it as attempts by public sector agencies and authorities to generate insight from the application of software algorithms to digital data sets with the aim of informing their decisions. So data for this purposes is not necessarily just confined to big data in the sense that it's used by Google, Amazon, Facebook and so on. In other words, I'm not just referring to the use of analytics on massive unstructured data that's generated by fine-grained behavioural tracking, although it does indeed include these kinds of techniques, but it also includes the use of analytics on smaller sets of data. And its theoretical underpinnings rest on data science, that is, the application of software algorithms to large data sets in order to identify patterns and correlations, and Christopher's already alluded to this, that can generate hidden insight, including, but not limited to, predictive analytics, which is aimed at predicting future behaviours. So the basic pattern is you have data, you apply the algorithms to that data to generate knowledge, and based on that knowledge, you can come up with an appropriate intervention or action to inform some kind of governmental decision. So I'm now going to suggest that this phenomenon, the new public analytics, can be understood and characterised as the conceptual successor to the new public management insofar as it follows logically from and grows out of the new public management. But even there is quite a lot of continuity between the two phenomenon in terms of its underlying drivers and conceptual underpinnings. The new public analytics is nevertheless conceptually novel and distinctive, and for this reason I'm going to suggest that it constitutes a potentially new paradigm in public administration. So to draw out the features of new public analytics, I'm going to contrast it with its predecessor, the new public management. So that means I need to say a little bit about what the new public management is or was. So this term, NPM, new public management, was a term that was coined in the late 1980s to denote a new emphasis on the management and production engineering of public service delivery, often linked to doctrines of economic rationalism. So in a sense, NPM denotes public service reform programs that were associated with a turn to managerialism, faith in the power of markets to drive efficiency and quality in public service delivery, although there were differences in how academics identified the various key traits associated with new public management. Well, the general view is that although it was extremely well taken up across a number of industrialized economies, by around about 2005, NPM no longer held sway over the public sector reform agenda, with leading public administrative scholar Christopher Yoo saying fairly recently, the agenda of public service reform has moved in some respects beyond the traits identified by scholars of public management in the 1990s. But then he goes on to say, in spite of its oft-proclaimed death, the term refuses to lie down and continues to be widely used. So you still see the use of the term NPM in current literature. So if we drill down to the core logic of new public management, its central doctrinal content is comprised of a mix of ideas drawn from corporate management, from institutional economics, and public choice. And at heart, it's about organisational reform. And the core idea here is that what we need to do is to split off policy from operations, and then we need to put at the head of the public organisation more discretionary space, more discretionary opportunities to make decisions along the lines of private sector managerial logic, and in return, that person, that manager becomes more directly accountable for their actions. So the idea was that the new public management would enable the public sector to be run along private sector managerial lines, and the thinking being that as consumers and firms became accustomed to private sector change, they would also demand similar kinds of service standards and attitudes from the public sector itself. Well, the new public management was extraordinarily successful insofar as it was widely taken up in a number of countries and across a large number of policy domains, with administrative lawyer Carol Harlow referring in 1997 to the overwhelming infiltration of new public management into public administration. So that gives you a sense of what new public management was about, and it enables us now to see the similarities and differences with what I'm going to call the new public analytics, to highlight its core conceptual and ideological features. So let's start with the similarities, or the shared features, and here you can see that there are a number of similarities. So for a start, both of them are concerned with some kind of public sector reform movement that is occurring in more than one industrialised economy. Both rest on a common commitment to apply successful private sector management ideas to the public sector, with the aim of improving or driving up quality, efficiency, and responsiveness in public sector decision-making. Both of them are aimed at optimising public sector decisions in some shape or form, and neither reform agenda is necessarily affiliated with a particular political agenda. That is, neither it was associated with a left-wing view of the world or a right-wing political agenda, even though the origins of the new public management began with Thatcherism in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US. These kinds of reforms were continued under New Labour following its election in the UK in 1997, and for that reason NPM is not seen as ideologically committed to either the left or right political agenda. And finally, both the new public management and the new public analytics are rooted in some kind of science. For the new public management, that was managerial science, and along with it, an apparent objectivity associated with that science. Similarly, for the new public analytics, it is associated with data science, and again portrayed as neutral, objective, and scientific. So much for the similarities. Nevertheless, there are some important differences and discontinuities, and this is why I'm going to suggest that it's a departure from what went before, and I refer to it as an emerging new paradigm. So if we think about the new public management, the central commitment, the central belief here is that in managers we trust, emphasising the role of the discretionary decision-making power of managers to improve the quality of public sector decision-making. In contrast, for the new public analytics, the central commitment is in data we trust, not in managers, in the data, emphasising the central role of data and data analytics to improve the quality of public sector decisions. They're based on different disciplinary approaches, so the new public management draws on the social sciences, especially economics and management studies, whilst the new public analytics draws on the natural and mathematical sciences, especially data science. On the one hand, new public management is primarily concerned with organisational reform, particularly the separation of policy from operational functions, to enable the competitive logic of markets to drive up service quality and efficiency, whilst in a quite different vein, the new public analytics is primarily concerned with the reform of knowledge production practices that are then intended to inform the accuracy, quality and responsiveness of decision-making at every level, that is from operational decisions through to policy evaluation and reform. So that means that I think we can see that despite the similarities, and the similarities enable us to say that there's some kind of continuity, so it's a gradual movement from one to the other, the discontinuities suggest that it's something distinctive and new, and for this reason I suggest that it's a successor and an emerging new paradigm in public sector administration, which is really only at its incipient stages. But the problem here is that if new public management died in around about 2005, and the new public analytics starts to emerge in around about 2013 or so, what happened in the intervening period? Well, I think there were a number of things were obviously going on in that time, but in public sector administration, I think there are two particular trends that are worthy of note, or sustained developments, which I think create fertile soil into which the new public analytics could take root. So firstly, that is the rise of risk as an organising principle in public sector administration, and the second is the digitisation of government. So let me speak very briefly about these two sustained trends. The first being the rise of risk as an organising principle in public sector decision-making frameworks. So here I have a quote from leading regulatory governance scholar Julia Black, who said back in 2005, "Risk is fast becoming the central organising principle in regulation and public service delivery. The UK," she said, "is currently awash with initiatives to promote risk management." So Julia Black suggested in 2005 that what we were witnessing at that point was the rise in what she called the new public risk management. And this comprised of two elements. The first was the use of internal risk management frameworks. And by this she meant that the public sector was transposing or taking the private sector risk management methods and adopting them for use in informing central government decision-making, the only difference being the way in which risk was defined. So, for example, in the private sector, the primary way in which risk is defined is in terms of risk to profitability, which makes complete sense. But of course that doesn't make sense in the public sector context because the aim is not profitability, so it's suggested. And so instead, risk is defined as risk that the government agency will fail to achieve its objectives or to deliver public services. So having redefined what risk means in the public sector, nonetheless all the other elements of the risk management process or framework of decision making remain the same. And so that means in the public sector you start by identifying your risk, then you move on to the risk assessment stage and you try and identify the sources of those risks and you try and identify or evaluate the magnitude of those risks, and then you can move on to the third stage of decision making, which is to try and manage those risks and mitigate them through strategies of risk management. So that constituted the first plank of the new public risk management, the second being the rise of risk-based regulation, which was essentially the application of internal risk management techniques to enforcement decisions. So it was a specific risk-based framework which was intended to help all of those public agencies that had responsibility for enforcing legal or regulatory standards to prioritise their attention and their enforcement resources. And this specific application in the enforcement context she refers to as risk-based regulation. Well, at the same time that that was happening, we also see a movement towards digital modernisation, or the rolling out of e-government or electronic government, or digital government if you prefer, referring to the application of IT to the practice of government and the efforts to modernise. So to adopt the definition of Scholl, he says, e-government refers to the use of information and technology to support and improve public policies and government operations, engage citizens and provide comprehensive, timely government services, the primary technology used being the internet. So Christopher has already referred to the digitisation of government a little bit in his talk, and we see here that the crucial focus is on the role of information communication technology, especially the internet, as a vehicle for substantially enhancing both governmental transparency and citizen participation, and to enhance the way in which citizens can communicate and interact directly with government. So not just able to obtain more information about government and therefore enhance transparency, but also to enable direct participation and interaction between citizens and governments themselves. So, for example, Dunleavy and Margette's claim that so-called digital era government prevailed or succeeded the new public management around 2005, which they refer to as a quasi-paradigm in public sector development. And they say that it constitutes a radically different mindset, culture and characteristic patterns of organisational government as part of this overall modernisation process. Well, that's a plausible theory, but the problem I have with the Dunleavy and Margette's theory that there's this digital era government emerging around about this time is that it emphasises the communications technology and downplays the role of data. And so what's distinctive about the new public analytics is that the ICT is crucial, but it's the crucial context and background which enables data to be captured and collected in order that it can be harnessed in order to generate insight and to input into public sector decision making. So in this sense, the new public analytics is something distinct from and a step onwards from digital modernisation of the ICT framework and the use of the internet. So it's these two developments that occur after 2005 that make it possible for the new public analytics to take root. And we see here, and I don't have much time left, I was going to tell you a little bit about what the state of play is with the new public analytics in British administration from a pilot study that I did with some colleagues in 2017. I don't have time to discuss them, but the bottom line is that although the take-up is patchy at the moment, very selective in specific domains, there are lots of obstacles to achieving the vision of data-driven government, which is underpinning this drive, and so there's a considerable gap between rhetoric and reality. But nonetheless, the drive towards moving in this direction certainly continues unabated. So that takes me to the final part of my talk then, which is, well, okay, let's accept that that's a plausible theory, that we are seeing the emergence of the rise of the new public analytics. What does all of this have to do with public law? Well, I guess the main point I want to make, and I'm going to gallop through these last few slides, is if we think back to the way in which public law has responded to the new public management back in the 1990s, public lawyers were very successful in starting to grapple critically with what challenges did the new public management pose for public law. And they were quite critical about what was going on, and they identified some real problems with the way in which accountability was being transformed by these changes in public sector organisation. And they identified the potential for accountability to be weakened as a result, but they also identified potential opportunities for new public management to improve particular forms and dimensions of accountability. Although between public lawyers themselves there was some disagreement about how we should best understand these problems and then how the law should respond to them in order to enhance or to ensure adequate public accountability. And that disagreement can be understood as growing out of different responses to what they understood the challenges were for executive power following the rise of the welfare state in the post-war period. So some of you who've been around for a long time like me and have taught administrative law for a long time may be familiar with Hullo and Rawlings' critique, where they used a metaphor of the traffic light to explain different kind of politically grounded approaches to identifying the nature of the problem and how public lawyers should respond. So red light theorists, on the one hand, were unhappy with the march of the collectivist state and the redistribution of wealth through law, and they saw this as an interference with liberty and property, and so their argument is what we need is an active judiciary to restrain the exercise of executive power. Green light theorists, on the other hand, were much more amenable to the use of law to facilitate state functions and regulation and redistribution and service provision, and they thought what we needed was democratic mechanisms of oversight via Parliament to ensure that the executive was restrained. Amber light theorists took a middle view. They conceded that there was the need to exercise public power for these redistributive purposes, and that public law had a role beyond merely controlling executive power, but they were sceptical of the adequacy of political techniques to do that, and so we needed to supplement those techniques with forms of legal control. So if we consider those kinds of debates and think about where we are today in response to the rise of the new public analytics, what I think is troubling is that I don't observe public lawyers taking up the baton and starting to really grapple with or even recognise that there is a revolution in governing afoot and starting to grapple with those problems, although I'm really encouraged by the number of panels concerning technology and law that have occurred at this conference. But interestingly, they're not sort of self-identified as public lawyers, and I suppose my call is for this law and technology critique to enter into the mainstream of the way in which public lawyers reflect upon the challenges of governing and government and holding power to account. Because I think the challenge for public lawyers, if we're to confront the new public analytics successfully, is to think about our principles, what it is that we care about as public lawyers, about the importance of nurturing meaningful political citizenship, for safeguarding the rule of law, for fighting for the common values upon which constitutional administrators are rooted. And to do that, I think we will need to reinvent ourselves and to learn to speak the language in which our smart environments are constructed and on which they are built. And these are the languages, as Christopher has already said, of computer science, of mathematics and data science, and which provide the disciplinary foundations of the new public analytics. Because if we cannot do that, if we can't converse with those who develop our smart environments and its operational routines, then we really won't be able to grapple effectively with understanding the nature of the problem that these smart environments pose for our principles. We don't, however, have to start with a blank sheet of paper, and Frank has done a wonderful job of giving us a sense of the kinds of critical literatures that are emerging in a field that is sometimes labelled as critical data studies or critical algorithm studies, if you prefer, and that lawyers are contributing to that discourse in a really helpful way, drawing attention to a number of features, and I won't repeat the ground that Frank has already trodden. And so there is some theoretical groundwork already out there, and here's a plug for my book, but it's a plug for law and technology as a disciplinary way of thinking or a subdisciplinary way of thinking, all of these critiques being able to be drawn together as a shared concern for securing algorithmic accountability. And I really urge public lawyers to start to engage more deeply with that kind of discourse. So just before I conclude, one final warning, and something that concerns me, is that so far when I've been talking about new public analytics, I've been focusing only on the use of analytics within the administration. But more disturbingly, there are some ideas or claims and enthusiasm within academia and institutional thinking that we should apply analytics right across all three branches of government. So not just the executive, but claims that we should see the judiciary using analytics to decide cases and that the legislature should be using it to inform lawmaking, some even suggesting that we should fully automate the whole kit and caboodle without any sense of irony. And if that is the case, if that is the place that we get to, and I refer to that as the new public analytics generation 2 or 2.0, then it will be far more disruptive than what I have been talking about, NPA version 1. Because NPA version 2 is not about public sector management reform, it is a new epistemology. It relies on a new form of knowledge production, a new way of knowing that for the time being, has no limits. And it's an approach to generating insight that could be applied to any kind of decision imaginable, and so it's therefore amenable to the other branches of government, and that makes it altogether more powerful, pervasive, and altogether potentially more dangerous, especially if we cannot identify and implement effective and legitimate checks and balances to safeguard against the abuse of algorithmic power. So to conclude then, I like the traffic light metaphor that Harlow and Rawlings use, and I think it's especially revealing if we think about where we are today and where we're probably going tomorrow. Because if you think about the hyper-networked smart environment, there are no traffic lights anymore. Traffic lights, traffic flow will be managed by the smart infrastructure. Decisions about whether a vehicle stops or not will be made by data-driven computational algorithms which continuously extract data from and are embedded into our technological artifacts and environments. So we will have no need for legal rules that prohibit drivers from proceeding through red signals. We won't have any need for police officers to monitor violations, and we will have no need for court officials to impose fines on errant drivers. So we must find ways to embed into our technological fabric mechanisms that can fulfill the purpose of our conventional legal mechanisms of oversight to ensure that the exercise of this decision-making power is properly and fairly exercised to safeguard against errors and abuse and to uphold the foundational values upon which the rule of law rests. The challenge is a large one. I don't think it's impossible, and it is increasingly urgent, given the breathtaking pace at which these technologies are being developed and rolled out. And a final word is we need to do it, and we need to do it now. We cannot afford to sit idly by and expect that the legal tools and doctrine of a pre-hyper-networked digital age will be fit for purpose, while our networked digital technologies radically reshape and reconfigure our institutions and our structures of power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Yeung. We'll now have about 10 to 15 minutes for some question and answer. In the interest of time, I'm going to take a couple of questions before passing on to our speakers to respond. So any questions from the floor? Right at the back over there.
Thanks very much for the great presentations. Malcolm Langford, University of Oslo. So a question to Frank and Karen. I agree that we need to be critical about legal automation, new public analytics, and a broader array of legal technologies from a public law perspective, public accountability, democratic control. But don't we also, as a public law community, need to be reflexive and appropriationist and see how legal technologies can be used for those very public values? So you named, Frank, the robo-social security scandal in Australia, but what was the response? It was actually a robo-lawyer organised by human rights advocates, which not only secured compensation from the scandal, but actually built a social movement through the robo-lawyering that actually brought unemployed beneficiaries into contact with the movement. We've now got the rise of robo-investors, and people are acknowledging that perhaps one of the only response to that is robo-regulators. So my concern is that in the private law community, you've got massive investment in legal technology. In the government sector, as Karen's brilliantly showed, we have massive investment, particularly in Europe. It's perhaps even going faster than the US. But where in the public law community are we looking to appropriate those technologies to actually, for the purposes of democratic control and accountability? And is there also a vision there from your perspective?
Any further questions? Yes, maybe we'll ask one more question before passing on to the speakers. Yes.
Thank you again for your wonderful presentations. I have a question for Professor Yoo. I agree totally with you when you said that all technologies are dual use. And so your final conclusion was, so the question is which kind of trade-offs we have to face. And the last one was accuracy and other values. So my question is, what if among those other values there are principles like equality principle, non-discrimination? Because as far as we understood from you and from data scientists, in a lot of cases, algorithms, if they want to be accurate, they must be biased. So there is an intrinsic link between bias and accuracy. So my point is, what if we start to use them? There is this sort of practical force of algorithms that is, okay, people that works in data science says, okay, we don't want to say what is just, what is true. We simply predict what is going to happen. But what if this start to be incorporated into the final decision? How can we manage this kind of trade-offs?
Yes, thank you. And one final question there before passing on to the three speakers.
I am Cristobal Caviedes. I'm from Queen's University. I wanted to ask you, the thing is that recently people like Yuval Harari and David Runciman and others have said that the technological challenge to liberalism is even greater than the one of populism. And there have been some calls of regulating these technologies pretty much like natural monopolies, like in the 19th century. But the problem that I see is, how do you regulate it? So, for example, natural monopolies, what would you do? Like ensure third-party access to algorithms or something like that? So I just wanted to know what's your opinion about it. How should we regulate these technologies? If so, if we need to do so. Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I do think, with respect to the last question, I do think that there's some great work out there by Sabeel Rahman, and I cite some of it in my tweet storm, on this question of public utility regulation and what that might look like in the future. And I think that's going to be part of the solution. I want to come to the question that was asked by Professor Langford, I guess, from the University of Oslo, about the robot lawyer. And this is something that actually I do a little bit of work on with my Rule of Persons Not Machines article. I look at the traffic chatbot Do Not Pay by Josh Browder. And I think it's very important that before we enthusiastically embrace chatbot lawyers, or with scare quotes around lawyer, we think about 4 problems that have arisen, I think, with them. First, that many times this is a very simple decision tree in chatbot, and the person using it is doing most of the work. I think that just with respect to the so-called Twitter revolution, the real revolution in social movement was in people, not in Twitter. Similarly, with respect to many of the phenomena that are celebrated as chatbot lawyers, the real intelligence is still in the humans using them. Second, oftentimes there are efforts to overclaim for what the chatbot lawyer can do. I saw that in the US there was some effort to say, well, we can sue Equifax for $25,000 on your behalf. We can help refugees with chatbot lawyers, et cetera. And people that are actually in the law, and even the magazine TechCrunch, the website, expressed incredulity that someone would try to automate a very high-stakes legal process. We might have someone who's a refugee, and if they don't pick the right box on the right form, they'll be sent back forever. There's no real due process. And to have someone market a chatbot saying that they can help them, it's deeply troubling. I mean, Silicon Valley may move fast and break things with respect to other parts of life. I think they should avoid a lot of this when it's very high stakes. Third, with respect to chatbot lawyers, there are terms of service that are problematic. If I go to an attorney, at least in the United States, and that attorney says to me, hey, I'd like you to sign a disclaimer that if I completely mess up your case, that you're not going to sue me for malpractice, you can't do that. Or at the very least, you have to have another lawyer review the lawyer's effort to disclaim responsibility under malpractice law. However, with respect to chatbots and some of this online legal advice, they do push these terms of service. Some state bars push back against them. Then there are techno-libertarians and cyber-libertarians in the federal government who push back and say that they have to be able to offer these unequal, oppressive terms to the users. That's problematic. Finally, I would note with respect to the chatbots that they often invite an arms race. So there's one that said, essentially, we're going to help you via a chatbot, avoid eviction. Well, guess what? It turns out that there's a firm called Click Notices that automates the effort to knock out people, including those who use the chatbot. In my work, Technology, Competition, and Values, I've talked about how technology is very often a force multiplier for the powerful, not necessarily an equalizer. And I think we really have to look at all of those elements of the science and technology studies, the ethics of technology, before we rush to embrace something that I think is what Brian Shepard calls premature disruption of the legal sector. Thanks.
So just, can you hear me? Is that working? Can you hear me? Yes, kind of. I think it's a very good question about whether or not we should use technological tools in response to the way in which technological tools are being used in these other sectors. I hope that nothing I said was interpreted as saying we should stick with our conventional doctrine. In fact, I think we must embrace technological protection mechanisms. So ideas, for example, like privacy by design are being expanded to think about what might human rights by design look like. We're developing already mechanisms for discrimination-aware data mining. There's a lot of work going on in explainable AI, and I think these are really important and critical tools that we as lawyers need to come to grips with and think about how we can help the computer scientists construct them and implement them in ways that are faithful to our principles. So I absolutely agree that we need to be able to embrace the technologies in ways that can be used to harness and to promote the foundational principles upon which constitutional democracies rest. But I think we're a very, very long way from understanding the nature of the problem, and that's where we have to start. But I absolutely think we're going to have to embrace technological tools to implement our commitments. In terms of the question about how to regulate these technologies, I think that's the $10 billion question. I think there's a really important role for regulation, and I do think it's very domain specific. So we have very stringent regulation, for example, in relation to aircraft safety. And so in safety critical domains, we must have very stringent requirements for the regulation of AI systems. But of course, it doesn't really matter so much if Amazon recommends you a pair of slippers in which you have no interest. So a lot will depend on the consequences of getting it wrong. What are the consequences of a type 1 and a type 2 error? And we need to think about regulatory measures in proportion to the risks that those wrong, erroneous decision-making outcomes generate. How we do that, of course, is still a very much an open question, and I do think that we really need to think hard about meaningful, enforceable legal standards that can ensure that these kinds of systems are trustworthy. And I'm deeply skeptical of the way in which the current discourse is so dominated by the claim for data ethics, which, as I just said to Frank, isn't worth the paper that it's not written on. I think legal institutions have a really important role to play, and that they need to be part of this conversation. So part of my kind of mission is to get lawyers to take up the mantle and to take seriously the importance of the role of law as part of the oversight and safeguard mechanisms that we need moving forward to make sure that we can harness the benefits of these incredibly powerful technologies.
So I wanted to thank you for the question. The easiest way for me to answer this is, how do we take into account bias? Is through the lens of the 1976 U.S. Supreme Court case, Craig versus Boren, which is the one that established the principle of gender discrimination under U.S. law. For those of you who don't remember, it was about low alcohol beer. Women could drink at 18, men had to wait till 21. And this is in the face of statistical evidence that young men abuse alcohol more frequently, and we're finding out from psychological reasons the judgment centers don't fully develop in young men until later than women. There's a physiological basis for this as well. And so we had a rule that was based on information that is discriminatory. We're treating men and women differently. And based on sound, apparently, sociological data. So we overturned that rule in the name of deviating from a statistical outcome in the name of equality. What that means is one of two things will happen. Either you level them at 18, in which case some young men will get alcohol at 18 who can't handle it, will have an increased number of accidents, and that you will have a cost. Or you will deny some women, you equalize at 21 and deny some women who are not at risk of drinking low alcohol beer from the liberty of doing so. I actually think that decision is correct. I'm not saying otherwise. What I want to say is we have to understand that is the cost. When you build in something that deviates from the statistical evidence, you're going to have to impose an obligation on someone and require that they do something that they either prevent a woman from doing something that would have been safe or allow a young man to do something that would be dangerous. And my point is not to say we never make those choices, it's to surface them and do them with both eyes open. A couple things. One thing I wanted to emphasize is people are pretty bullish about AI. AI is not a panacea. It is best at repetitive, pattern-based activities. And there's including some brilliant things. So one of the most favorite ones I think of is they have these programs that will write articles about high school sporting events and give them coverage about who was the high scorer and all this. And it's a tremendously wonderful thing, but that you can cookie cutter very simply. From a lawyer standpoint, routine real estate purchases, wills are just begging for automation because they are pattern-based and they're not there. Now, will that handle the fancy real estate deals? No. But understanding the proper domain of AI, I think, will solve a lot of problems. The other thing that you have to bear in mind is that if the alternative to AI is pure human-based decision-making, based whether you're talking about recidivism or risk of different things, there actually is pretty good evidence that, in fact, they may do better. And that, in fact, we talk about algorithms having biases. The humans have biases, too, cognitive defects or actual racism. And I always think about in a lot of the critiques between sports analytics that it's actually not all the data or all the human judgment. You actually really want some melding of the two. And that, in fact, the false dichotomy tends to point things a bit too starkly. Lastly, about the remedial, how do you regulate it? Two comments. One is I'm actually not as bullish about public utility regulation as Frank is. I actually have some writing studying actually when it works and when it doesn't. And it does work sometimes and there's a series of parameters about the commodity nature of the product and the built-out nature. There's certain times where it's worked well and certain areas where it's worked badly. The hard part here is to think about this as a system. So there was, to give you a concrete experiment, some people, they were actually looking at advertisements for science and technology fields to make sure they were gender balanced. And they pushed through an algorithm to make sure that regardless of the analytics, they would actually present them equally to men and women. And they did. Here's the problem. They still got a biased result. Why? Because the female customers were so much more valuable to other advertisers. The algorithm got outbid. And when you put complex phenomena into a decentralized system, which is what we're having, you can correct for all these biases and still not get the result you're looking for. And so we discovered it's pretty hard to do sometimes. And on the other hand, these very valuable women are actually ostensibly seeing an advertisement that they might value more. And so we have this very complex phenomenon that's going to be very, very difficult to regulate.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Yoo, Professor Yeung, Professor Pasquale for their extremely insightful, stimulating, and, well, for me at least, highly educational viewpoints and discussions.